Hello, 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 and welcome to the Crisis Comms Mastery Summit. I'm so excited to be here. We've been promoting this for a long time just because how much we believe in what this whole event is all about. And thank you to Agility PR Solutions and Bulldog Reporter for putting this together for all of us. So my name is Melissa Agnes. I am the founder and CEO of an organization called the Crisis Ready Institute. I'm also the author of the book, Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World. And over the last more than a decade, I have been working with organizations to help them preemptively be in a position to overcome challenge, be it issues or crisis, which we'll talk about today, proactively in real time in a way that actually fosters increased trust and credibility in their brand. So negative incident strikes, you build your brand equity because you do right by the people you serve. That's what I'm all about. That's what the Institute's all about. And that's what I want to help you here with today. So let's dive right in. The world has entered an era of change and challenge that will continue well into 2021 and beyond. I remember in 2019, I sit on a bunch of different boards. I sit at some very interesting global tables with different leaders from around the world. And I remember in 2019, I was at a specific table and we were talking about the way the world was changing, was transforming, and all of the abundance of new risk and new impact that we were about to enter into. This is pre-COVID. This is pre us knowing, like even anticipating COVID. And at these tables, we were looking at what does the next 5 years look like? Because at the time, we started thinking that we have maybe if we're lucky, 5 years before this new era of challenge and change commences. And I remember halfway through 2019, it became evident that we didn't have 5 years. So we changed the conversation entirely and we started looking at the next 6 months and what this means for crisis readiness on a global scale. And then 2020 hit and COVID hit. And since that was kind of the debut. And as you know, as you've experienced, there has been a myriad of challenges, a growing magnitude of change. And all of this has been in 2020, will continue in 2021, and we're entering into a new normal and a new era of, again, challenge and change. So then the big question becomes, how do you get ahead, right? And these challenges extend beyond COVID. So we're looking at things like cybersecurity, especially since COVID. We've seen an uprise in cybersecurity and how that can critically impact an organization. We're looking at geopolitics and the impact on organizations and economy as a result of that. Natural disasters with global warming and all of the things that we're seeing. New world changes and adaptations, just how this new era has evolved and the changes and adaptations, or the changes that lead to the adaptations that we need to be able to foresee, anticipate, and get ahead of in order to thrive in this new economy or this new landscape. Racial inequity. 2020, we saw a big rise in an intolerance in racial inequity and a big rise in the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what that can mean for your brand in terms of risk if you aren't on that page, if you aren't ready for integrating the changes that might need to happen within your organization. Recession, or at the very least, a hurting economy, which we're all faced with right now. And then all of this equals to reputational risk and impact, and the challenges that reputational risk and impact adds to all of these challenges, along with a whole bunch of other high risk scenarios, as they call them, that pertain to you, your teams, your business, your stakeholders. So for me, it's always about that anticipation. It's always about getting ahead. How can we make sure that our clients, that are the professionals in our world, are ready to stay ahead of the change and the challenge in order to own the crisis, whatever the crisis may be? And you'll hear me talk about transforming real-time challenge into real-time opportunity. That isn't meant to be a cliche. That is meant to be an opportunity to actually transform, take challenge, and emerge from it stronger and more connected with the people your brand is designed to serve. Rise as a leader for your teams, your communities, and your stakeholders. And this is something that we're going to talk about in a minute, how there is an opportunity right now. There's a void of leadership, and there's an opportunity, a great opportunity for you and your organization to rise into this. Alleviate undue stress for you and your teams. We're going to talk about the difference between an issue and a crisis and what that means. And even just there, too often we see professionals who are faced with an issue. Maybe it's a viral issue, maybe it's a very impactful issue, but it isn't a crisis, and yet it feels like a crisis. And so it's responded to as a crisis. And even just the effect of understanding the difference, intrinsically understanding the difference, and the stress that you can alleviate for you and your teams is significant and very, very merited and very needed in this day and age. And then, of course, to thrive amidst change and challenge, to thrive in this new economy. So as a communication professional, you are at the forefront of this. You are big time at the forefront of this. Effective communication is crucial for your crisis-ready success. We're going to talk about, what it takes to successfully manage a crisis in this day and age, or just period. And communication is at the forefront of that. You are leading, or you are amidst the leaders of being crisis ready, of transforming those challenges into opportunities, including your roles and responsibilities, or the effects. The success of effective communication in issue and crisis management leads to incident mitigation altogether. Absolutely. And I'm always about being proactive, right? Crisis ready is about being proactive. So incident mitigation, incident de-escalation, getting ahead of emotion and being able to take a potentially rising and very impactful situation and de-escalating that down from a crisis down to an issue and then down to a non-issue. As communication professionals, this is one of the opportunities as well as one of the responsibilities that you have on your shoulder when it comes to incident response. Trust building and trust maintaining, which is critical for the viability and the vitality of your organization. Owning the narrative, not letting an incident's narrative become everybody else's story that dictates your success or your failure, and actually owning the narrative of an incident that's impacting your organization. And then, of course, leading through crisis. And that brings me to my second point. There exists a big opportunity today to lead today and moving forward. One of the things I mentioned earlier, that I sit at some very interesting tables around the world. And one of the things that I witnessed, that I observed at the start of COVID, was no matter what table I was at, no matter who sat at that table with me, some of the leading leaders of our world and of different countries and big, large, massive organizations, even those leaders were looking for leaders. Every human, we have this natural desire to look and to be led, right? We want answers, and then we want to know what to do and feel safe and secure in taking action on those answers. And at the start of COVID, there was a severe lack on a global scale, both in government and in corporations, of leadership, which created a void. And the lack of leadership was a result of people not having answers. No matter what table I sat at, nobody had all of the answers. Nobody knew what tomorrow was going to bring. We were in a highly volatile and highly unprecedented situation. And yet people were searching for answers, and leaders, unfortunately, were not comfortable in that space of uncertainty. So instead of coming out and leading today and knowing that tomorrow something new might happen and they'll have to roll with those punches and potentially retract statements or deviate on plans and action items and being comfortable with that, instead what we saw were too many leaders who were uncomfortable with that unpredictability and that uncertainty. And so therefore waited and waited and waited and waited and waited for tomorrow, for more answers to come, when tomorrow's answers took months to come. So being crisis ready, having a team that's crisis ready, enables you to be comfortable in that space of leadership. And if everybody is searching for a leader, especially in crisis, this creates a beautiful opportunity for you as a professional, for your team, and for your organization to rise as a leader for your constituents and continue. Again, it's always about coming out of a crisis with increased trust and credibility, giving your team and your organization the capability, the capacity, and the confidence to do that. So you have a lot on your shoulders as a communication professional. It's a lot of opportunity, it's a lot of challenge. And today, I want to help you be in a position to be a step further, or leaps and bounds further, in overcoming those challenges. So one of the things, talking about crisis readiness and crisis response, mitigating unnecessary consequences. So the longer you take to effectively respond to an incident, three things happen. The more control over the narrative you lose, the longer you take to effectively respond to an incident, the more everybody will go search elsewhere for or put in their narrative of your story, right? And people will start to believe those narratives because you're not coming forth with your own communication. The more trust and credibility you destroy, and the more material impact you risk suffering. And we refer to this at the Institute, we refer to this as the crisis response penalty. So basically, in essence, it's incident occurs, this is a timeline, incident occurs, and the longer you take to effectively respond to that incident, the more control over the narrative you lose, the more trust and credibility you lose, and the more material impact you risk suffering. Incident occurs. Sometimes we don't have full control over this. Some incidents are unpredictable or unpreventable, and some are not. So incident occurs, you're going to suffer some kind of material impact here or some kind of consequence here. This CRP, the crisis response penalty, is completely mitigatable, is completely avoidable. And so that's what I want to help you today in becoming crisis ready. Make sure that when an incident responds, you are as close as possible to the right timeline to responding effectively to avoid all unnecessary consequences. In order to do that, crisis management requires two things to happen together effectively with a lot of strength and simultaneously. That is taking the right actions to course correct, to address the situation, to manage the situation, to fix the situation, whatever it calls for, and to communicate effectively. Successful crisis management requires both of these things. You cannot successfully manage a crisis by only taking the right actions and not telling anybody what you're doing, nor can you successfully manage a crisis by telling people all the right things, but not actually doing and doing what you say by taking the right actions. That communication piece, when I talk about your role and responsibility in a crisis, as well as in issue management, is extremely critical, as you can see. And worth noting, everything you do and everything you do not do is an action. Everything you say and everything you do not say is a communication. And you always have two options to manage a situation. You can either mismanage it or manage it well. And we're going to talk more about that in a little while. So before we get into the how-to, I want to set the tone. I want to set the stage on what it means to be crisis ready. Crisis ready is a term that I coined many years ago because I personally wasn't satisfied with status quo. Status quo being crisis preparedness was the terminology, the lingo associated with status quo, and status quo being a plan, the creation of a plan, a crisis management plan that is a stagnant document that is created, checks off a box, sits on a shelf somewhere, and then for whatever reason, gives leadership solace in thinking that in the event of a crisis, we could just reach for that plan, pull it out, open it up, follow it, and it'll guide us through to crisis management success. I very, very early on in my career realized how inaccurate this was. And any organization who had a crisis management plan that was stagnantly sitting on a shelf waiting at the start of 2020, unfortunately, realized in real time with real dire consequences how ineffective and inefficient that approach, that mindset to crisis preparedness is. So I was quickly frustrated with my industry, with the status quo of crisis preparedness. And so I coined the term crisis ready. And crisis ready, therefore, means something very, very specific to me and to the people, everybody, the family at the Crisis Ready Institute. It means having an entire culture of an organization. So every single member of your team is intrinsically has the intrinsic ability to quickly identify risk at its onset. So today, we never know who's going to be the first person to be in a position to identify something that we need to be identified, that we need to identify so that we suffer the least amount of crisis response penalty. Having every single person on your team across the organization, in every department, in every unit, in every division around the world, having the ability to quickly be able to identify risk at its onset. From there, being able to properly assess and categorize that risk. In other words, is it an issue or is it a crisis? And what does that mean? What do they do with that? We're going to talk about that in a second. And then ultimately, I keep talking about transforming challenge into opportunity. Being crisis ready means that every member of the team has an intrinsic ability, a skill set that is learnable to respond effectively. Effective response means de-escalating the situation as quickly as possible. It means suffering the least amount of material impact on your brand, on your organization. And then in crisis ready, we take it a step further as a guiding beacon. We are constantly looking to respond to any type of incident, any type of negative event or challenge in a way where we build trust and credibility with the people who matter most to the business. And that's when I talk about building brand equity through challenge, right? Connecting with people and strengthening those relationships and strengthening the viability of the business amidst challenge. And so this is the definition of crisis ready, and crisis ready absolutely needs to be cultural. In order to get to this level of crisis readiness, it takes the right mindset, it takes the right skill set, and it takes the right capabilities internally, so process, procedure, etc., to support the mindset and the skill set. It is very, very different than having a plan, a document sitting on a shelf somewhere waiting for a crisis. This is an entirely different approach. This is the approach that actually builds true resilience and the name of the book is Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World. So I want to work with you today over the next several minutes to look at skill set and capability and see, and like I said, take you leaps and bounds. And if you put together these exercises, if you conduct these exercises with your teams, simple and profound exercises, you will start to really ingrain this crisis ready mindset, skill set, and capability, which translates into a crisis ready culture, which puts your organization in this era of challenge and change in a very, very advantageous position. So let's do it. Becoming crisis ready. I want to talk first. I talked about issue and crisis, and we said being crisis ready means you have an entire team that's able to identify risk, assess its material impact, and respond in the right way. So identifying risk and assessing its material impact is the first step, right? And as I said previously, far too often we see organizations that suffer issues that feel like crises in the moment and that are responded to as crisis with heightened stress levels that are not necessary and an ineffective response as a result, which can equal to a CRP, a crisis response penalty, which we want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the definition of a crisis and the definition of an issue as a framework that then you can take to your team, and an exercise along with that to take to your teams so that you can truly define crisis and issue for your organization. Because a crisis for one organization does not necessarily translate into a crisis for another. And that's really important to understand. If we look at COVID, for example, COVID, this global pandemic, has been a crisis for an overwhelming number of organizations. If we look at Zoom, the digital platform for connection, if we look at Zoom amidst crisis, or amidst COVID, COVID was not a crisis for Zoom. COVID was an opportunity, right? Their business boomed as a result of the impacts of COVID. So on that scale, it wasn't a crisis. So a crisis for one organization does not necessarily translate into a crisis for another. So having these definitions and this frameworks and understanding the thresholds between issue and crisis for your organization is critically important for your crisis readiness. So the definition of a crisis. A crisis is an event or situation that, and I do not say a negative event or situation, a boom in business, looking at Zoom, a boom in business, if you don't have the capacity to support that boom, a boom in business is super positive, but if you don't have the capacity to support it, that might be a crisis for your organization, right? So it's not necessarily a negative event. It's an event or a situation that stops business as usual to some extent. It stops business as usual, and it requires immediate escalation straight to the top of leadership. So that means that no matter what meetings leadership's in, no matter if they're in their bed sleeping, no matter if they're away on vacation on the other side of the world, a crisis is an event or situation that stops business as usual and requires them to get out of that meeting, to get up out of bed, or to get out of their vacation, to come home from their vacation, because this situation impacts people, the environment, operations, reputation, and or bottom line of the organization. So a crisis is an event or situation that stops business as usual, requires immediate escalation straight to the top of leadership, because it requires leadership's guidance and strategic directives due to the fact that this situation threatens material impact on people, the environment, the business's operations, its reputation, and or its bottom line. Whereas an issue, now I'm going to call an issue a negative event. An issue is a negative event or situation that does not stop business as usual. It does not stop business as usual. I see issue management as business as usual on hyperdrive. It is the unpleasant part of our jobs, of your job, of your team's job, but it is still a part of their job or of your job. It does not require immediate escalation straight to the top of leadership. Leadership can continue to be in that meeting, they can continue to dream, or they can continue to enjoy vacation with their family. It's business as usual on hyperdrive, or it's that unpleasant part of business, because this situation does not threaten material impact on people, the environment, the organization's operations, its reputation, or its bottom line. And this can be a little bit challenging to conceptualize, right? So as an exercise to really define issue versus crisis for your organization, you want to sit down with your team, sit down with as many people on your team from across the organization as possible, because everybody's touch point within the organization is different. Everybody has a different high-risk scenario that keeps them up at night. So coming together to perform this exercise is really critical. And start by listing out all of the negative things or all of the negatively impactful things that the organization is at risk to. Every human being, every business is at risk of something, is prone to some kind of risk, right? We're not, it's just a factor of life. So sitting down and making a list of all the different risks that keep people up at night or that would have material impact, and then looking at them and defining the criteria, the threshold that defines issue from crisis or crisis from issue. So at what point, if you take one high risk scenario, and I'll use an example in a second, if you take one high risk scenario, at what points would that scenario only be an issue? Versus at what points would that scenario now become a crisis or a potential crisis for the organization? What made the difference? What are those, I call those defining the thresholds of your high risk scenarios. So what escalated it? What criteria was triggered or impacted that escalated that situation to a crisis? Likewise, what would happen in the situation? What impact or risk would be mitigated, avoided, or prevented to de-escalate a crisis down to an issue level? You want to define the criteria, the thresholds that define issue versus crisis. And taking the opportunity in this exercise with your teams to learn from the last year. The last year gives us so much opportunity for growth and evolution and awareness and education. So just looking at COVID and looking back from a year ago, from March 2020, was COVID an issue or a crisis for your business? Why? What were the defining criteria that made it an issue or made it a crisis for your organization? At the time, go back to March or April or June of 2020 and think through what felt like a crisis that today, with the benefit of hindsight, you realize or you're aware that, oh, that was only an issue. It felt like a crisis, but it was only an issue. Why did it feel like a crisis? Why was it only an issue? And what can you learn from that moving forward? And putting it into, I'm a big advocate for frameworks, because frameworks are scalable. You want your crisis ready program to be scalable across your organization over time as your organization changes and evolves, as well as the times change and evolve. So answering the why questions behind things, why is one of my favorite words, enables you to truly understand the framework behind the answers and then apply that in a scalable fashion throughout the organization. At what point did the situation, COVID, or the impacts of COVID, escalate or de-escalate from one to the other, from crisis to issue, from issue to crisis? At what point did that happen? Go back through the timeline of the last 12 months and really pinpoint those points and define the criteria that equated to that result. If it were to happen again, would it be an issue or would it be a crisis? And why? If it were to happen again, it most certainly should not be a crisis because now we've experienced it, right? We need to learn and grow and evolve. So if it happened again, would it be an issue or a crisis? If you were to say crisis, asking why and correcting that, strengthening those vulnerabilities is one of your next steps. And then looking at mindset. So I talked earlier about crisis readiness being mindset, skill set, and capability to support the two. Mindset is extremely critical for your crisis ready culture. Mindset is led from the top, is supported bottom up. And one of the things that I constantly say is the lens through which you choose to see a negative event directly impacts the actions that you take, which will directly impact the results of that event on your organization. So this last question is meant to help you shape mindset, help you evaluate and shape mindset. So what are the opportunities that emerged from COVID for you, for your team, for your business, for your industry, and for your stakeholders? What were the opportunities? How can you replicate those? How can you strengthen those? What opportunities have evolved or can you find through those opportunities? So if you take the framework of issue and the framework of the definition of crisis, and you undergo an exercise with your team, you can take 2 hours to do this as a starting point. Undergo an exercise with as many members of your cross-organizational team as you possibly can. Take the definitions, take the framework, use real life examples, define the thresholds of what an issue is versus what a crisis is. What are the triggering points that escalate or de-escalate a situation up or down? And use COVID and the last year as a very real, very live, very tangible, very crucial aspect of this exercise as a learning point. This is one of the most fundamental, foundational steps of becoming crisis ready. And taking this back to your team, again, crisis ready means having an organization that has the ability to identify, assess, and respond effectively to risk. This is one of those very, very fundamental foundational components to that should be brought to the rest of your team. So we talked about identifying risk and assessing risk. The next thing that I want to share with you guys here today is how to respond effectively. We have all, you as communicators, have been put through the test and have probably experienced a lot of communication challenges and triumphs over the last year. So one of the things, I always work in frameworks so that it's scalable. One of the things that I want to help you do is overcome emotion, to strengthen your crisis communication skills. And in fact, your skills in general to overcome emotion, because emotion plays a very significant role in any type of crisis, as well as in escalating issues. And it's extremely challenging to overcome emotion and truly resonate with the people that you need to resonate with. So I want to focus today a little bit on this to help you enhance your skill set for communication in issue and crisis management. So looking at getting ahead of emotion. At the Crisis Ready Institute, we have several crisis ready rules. Crisis ready rules are also scattered throughout the book. Crisis ready rules are designed to be thought provokers and conversation discussion provokers within your organization, as well as rules to fall back on to help guide you when you're being challenged, right? When you're faced with challenge and you may not necessarily know exactly in the heat of the moment which way to go. So one of our crisis ready rules is you cannot beat emotion with logic. One of the biggest challenges can be actually overcoming emotionally escalating situations in times of both issue and crisis management. And that is because emotion clouds judgment. Like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, I certainly don't at times in my life, but we are all human. We are human beings, and human beings are emotional beings. And as such, emotion plays a very large role in incident management and incidents period. And then of course in incident management. So I see it as emotion is the heart and logic is the brain, right? And emotion clouds judgment. So in a highly emotionally compelling or emotionally impactful situation, what happens is the heart blocks the brain. And we are thinking and breathing and just kind of living and experiencing through our hearts, through our emotions. And it clouds judgment. It leads to rational thought getting compromised, even by the most rational of humans. And that's why I say we're all human. We're all susceptible to this. People becoming more challenging to reason with because they're only thinking and breathing and, just reacting through their emotions. And the situation can quickly escalate and spiral out of control as a result of this, because it becomes even more, if their brain is being blocked, right, is being clouded by, their judgment's being clouded by their emotion, and you're trying to communicate rationally to them, that rationale is being blocked by emotion. So in other words, you need to be able to get in through the heart in highly emotionally compelling situations so that you can reach that rational side of the brain and actually guide them through the crisis the way that you need to, or lead them through the crisis the way that you need to. Emotion can amplify the challenges of issue management and crisis management. So it's something to be very, very mindful and aware of. And of course, there's a framework, there's a crisis ready framework to help you do this. And when we're dealing with humans, emotion is always a risk of being an amplifier, no matter what. And this goes internally and externally. You and your team are human. Externally, your stakeholders are human. So being aware of emotion is truly one of those crisis ready skills that we need to hone. So getting ahead of emotion, there are two important factors to be skilled at when overcoming emotionally charged situations. The first is to detect it, right? So it's part of the crisis readiness, but the quicker you can detect a situation having a high likelihood of being emotionally compelling, the more advantage and opportunity you have to get ahead of it. And then of course, the way in which you respond to emotionally compelling situations. So there is a crisis ready formula for each of these two things, detection and response. So detecting the risk of emotional escalation. There's a crisis ready formula. So in essence, you are saying it's an emotionally compelling situation of whatever nature that is highly relatable. That emotion and the situation itself is highly relatable and it's easy to share. So if I'm impacted by it and I think that you're going to be impacted by it or resonate, align with my emotion on it, and I can easily share it with you, which let's face it, in this day and age, everything is easily shareable. Then you have a situation, you have a recipe for heightened risk of emotional escalation. Heightened risk of virality is another way to look at that. So instilling this, taking this framework, taking this crisis ready formula to your team, and in situations looking and saying, what is the emotional compellingness of this situation? Is it highly relatable? And then is it easy to share? And getting at least ahead of the risk of something being emotionally compelling and escalating, so that you don't find yourself playing catch up. So that's the purpose of this formula. If you go to crisisreadyinstitute.com, you can download these formulas for free and bring them to your team. And then the next one, and the most important one, is how to respond to emotion. So of course, there's a formula for this. So we say that emotion, again, emotion clouds judgment, right? So in order to get to that logical side of the brain, to really rationally communicate with people and guide them to safety or let them know that they're safe, whatever the situation calls for, you need to first get into the heart, which means that as a communicator, your communications need to be wrapped in this order with these three things. So first is validation. Validate the emotions being felt. This is critical for crisis communication success. Critical for crisis communication success. Even if the emotions being felt, you feel that they are irrational, they still need to be validated because human beings have a tendency to need to feel validated. They need to feel heard. We need to feel heard. And if you take your company out of it and you think when you're in an argument or a disagreement with a spouse or a loved one, if you are trying to communicate together to overcome the challenge, right? And one of you doesn't feel heard or doesn't feel emotionally validated, then that person is going to keep trying to be heard and be validated. You're never going to get beyond that point until that person, whether it's you or the other person, feels heard and validated. So get ahead with your communications within your crisis communication framework and make sure that first and foremost, emotions are being validated. In order to know how and what to validate, you have to understand and identify the emotion being felt, which goes back to the previous formula. Once you've validated emotion and people feel heard and they feel validated, the next step is to relate to what matters to them. They want to know that what matters deeply, deeply emotionally to them matters to you. Because if it doesn't matter to you, why do they care? Why are they going to listen? They're going to turn their ears and they're going to go listen to third parties, right? So validate and then relate on an emotional level to what matters emotionally to them. When you do that, you are helping to disarm people. You're helping to disarm whatever they're feeling, the hostility, whatever the urge, the need that they feel to be heard and to be validated and to know that it matters to you too, just as much as it matters to them. You start to disarm them so that now they've said, okay, I'm heard, I'm understood, I'm validated. What matters to me matters to them. Okay, let them prove it. And this is when you gain the permission to come in with the logic, with the facts, with the whatever needs to be said, communicated, action and communication, right? This is when you are granted the permission to do that. This is how you get in through the heart in order to speak to the logical side of the brain when you need to most. And when I talk about being crisis ready and coming out of any challenge with increased trust and credibility, this is a massive, massive way to help you achieve that. I want to share a story with you to make this real. And we're not going to talk about COVID. We're not going to talk about anything like critically serious because I think we've had enough of that in the last year. So back in 2018, the show This Is Us. So for those of you who may not know, This Is Us is it's an Emmy Award-winning show. It's one of the most popular television shows on primetime TV today, including today or up to today. And spoiler alert, so I am going to kind of reveal something here. In 2018, This Is Us decided to do a grand reveal in one of their episodes of how one of the most beloved characters on the show, the patriarch of the family, Jack Pearson, died. So they had, you know, since the beginning of the show that he dies at some point, you just never know how. There's always this buildup of how. In 2018, just before the Super Bowl, they reveal how he dies. And the scene is an incredibly emotionally compelling scene. The whole show is beautifully crafted and with compelling emotional scenes and stories and lessons and different things. And so this scene is no different. And so the scene goes, you see Jack at night, he's cleaning up the kitchen. He goes on his way to bed. As he leaves the kitchen, he flips the switch on a generic slow cooker. Part of the scene is the story behind how they got the slow cooker, which is an emotionally compelling story. And so you're attached to the family and the story behind the slow cooker. And he flips the switch, goes to bed. It's an old, faulty, generic slow cooker that unfortunately, this is where the spoiler alert comes in, short circuits and sets flames to the house, and Jack dies of smoke inhalation. Story, fictitious story on a great show, emotionally compelling, highly relatable. So I want to put you in the scene. You are amidst 15 million people who watch this show every week. And you're sitting there and you're watching the story and it's pulling on your heartstrings and you're so sad about what's happening. So you were absolutely emotionally compelled. And then your brain goes to, oh my goodness, I have a slow cooker. I have a crock pot machine. I don't want this to happen to my family. I don't want them to die or for our house to be set to flames. So I'm going to throw out my crock pot machine and never use it again. This may sound irrational, but this is exactly what Crock-Pot woke up to the next morning that the show aired. So they woke up to thousands of generational clients, customers, threatening to throw out their current and their generational crock-pots that were hand-me-downs from grandparents that have emotional connection and story ingrained in their families, threatening to throw them out because they wanted to save, but to mitigate the risk of their family dying the way that Jack died. Could feel irrational. It was very, very real. The story was emotionally compelling. The relatability piece was, oh my goodness, this could be me. And then of course, it's highly shareable. So people took to Twitter and to social media to share how they were feeling, realize that they were relating to other people. And this whole boycott Crock-Pot, throw out your Crock-Pot machine frenzy occurred. It was covered in pretty much every morning talk show. Stephen Colbert put it in his monologue that evening. So this was a situation for Crock-Pot. Issue or crisis? So quickly, briefly in your mind, was this an issue or was this a potential crisis for Crock-Pot? I'm going to talk about a little bit, show you why it was a potential crisis. We buy, as human beings, we buy off of emotion, right? The studies have researched this and show us that we buy emotionally. We make purchases off of emotion. Whether people realize it or not consciously, what this story and the impact of this story did was associate Crock-Pot with the death of their families. That's a very, very intrinsic, that is a very, very real feeling. So foresee, think through in a year, in 2 years, in 3 months, your customers, your Crock-Pot, your customers walking through the department store, they cross by the brand Crock-Pot machine, and whether they consciously realize it or not, this triggers a deep-seated emotion that associates that machine and that brand to the death of their family. Think of and we purchase based off of emotion. Whether they understand the emotion or not, they're probably not buying that machine. Potential crisis for Crock-Pot. So Crock-Pot wakes up to this frenzy on social and beyond, and the risk of losing these lifetime generational customers that they value implicitly. What they did, I'm going to show you an example of the communication, one of their communications. They put out a whole bunch, but one of the communications that really gives a snippet of kind of the strategy that they took. And you'll notice the crisis ready formula being used here. So this is one communication in response to a customer who's starting to throw out their Crock-Pot machine. We totally get it. Last night's episode was heartbreaking and we're still not over it either. That is a validation. That is not saying what you're feeling or thinking is ridiculous. This has never happened before in the lifetime or history of Crock-Pot. It's ridiculous. That's not what they're saying. They're saying that thing that triggered your emotion, oh my goodness, it was so devastating. It was devastating for us too. We want to assure you that we're committed to safety and you can continue to use our products. So we want to assure you that we're committed to safety. They understood what people were scared about, what the triggering effect was, what the triggering emotion was, and they related to it. What matters to you matters to us. And then they came in with their directives, their studies, their everything that they pointed to, their logic, their proof. Validate, relate, and then prove. In times of crisis and issue management, get ahead of emotion, get through the heart to speak to the logical side of the brain, and continue to foster and strengthen relationships with the people who matter most to your organization, to your business. This is a framework that can apply to every single one of your communications, not just your issue and crisis management communication. And in order to do this, the exercise that I want to leave you with is a stakeholder mapping exercise. You cannot validate and relate and communicate effectively with your stakeholders unless you truly understand who your stakeholders are, what their relationship is with the brand, what they care about, where they need to receive the means of communication, where they need to receive your communications, etc. And this is answered, these questions are answered through conducting a stakeholder mapping exercise. And again, crisis readiness is cross-organizational, so this should not happen in a vacuum with only your team. So who are your stakeholders? Draw out a list. Who are your stakeholder groups and what are the subset of stakeholders within those groups? What is their relationship with the brand and how are they emotionally connected to the brand? Using Crock-Pot, we know that it's a generational thing. We know that we gather around with our families with food, and Crock-Pot is in the center of that for so many households, from memories from when they were kids straight through to memories that they create and share with their own kids, right? What is the emotional connection and relationship with the brand? What matters most and how is that emotionally tied? What are their expectations in the brand? In the event of a crisis, what do your different stakeholders expect of your organization? What can you anticipate? Looking at strategic foresight, looking at the ability to detect the likelihood of emotional escalation and then respond to it to get ahead of it. What can you anticipate? What's going to matter to them? What are the questions that they are absolutely, whether it's comfortable or not to answer, they're absolutely going to need answers to, right? What are the answers? What are the emotions they're going to be feeling? How can you address those emotions? What can you anticipate? How do expectations get met? What is the means of communication? Primary versus secondary means of communication by stakeholder group. Who's responsible for communicating with your different stakeholder groups? How do you get those responsible parties, the approved communications, to make sure that there's a unified voice across the organization to communicate effectively? How do you arm them, equip them with the frameworks and the skill set that we're talking about here today, so that when you give them the approved communication, they can deliver it with emotional intelligence? And how do you put your team in the position to be ahead, which is exactly everything that I just said now? Understanding issue versus crisis, the thresholds, and making that relatable, drawing upon the last year of experience for your organization, making that relatable and integratable to your organization moving forward in a scalable framework, and understanding who your stakeholders are and the impact, the challenge of emotion when it comes to issue and crisis management, and building in these frameworks, these crisis ready formulas for effectively communicating in times of crisis. All of this, when I talk about that crisis response penalty, when I talk about being crisis ready and having this intrinsic skill set across the organization that is so far beyond just having a plan that's stagnantly sitting in a file or in a drawer somewhere. These are foundational components to get you to that level. And that level, moving forward in this era of change and challenge, is what we need to be at. It's what you need to be at. It's what your team needs to be at. Bring these things to your team so that everybody can effectively identify risk at its onset, properly assess it, and respond effectively in a way that increases the trust and the credibility and strengthens the overall connection and equity of your brand. As a working in partnership and as a sponsor of this incredible event hosted by Agility PR Solutions and Bulldog Reporter, the Crisis Ready Institute has put together 2 initiatives for you to help you progress forward. And if you go to crisisreadyinstitute.com/CCM, so for Crisis Comms Mastery, CCM, you're going to find a webpage that's dedicated specifically to you and to your organization as part of being a part of this mastery event and wanting to up-level your skills in these important critical areas. There's a crisis ready coaching program designed for you. Everything that I talked about today, specifically aimed for communicators and your teams. There's very, very interesting. It's a 6-month program that helps you integrate the right mindset, the right skill set, and the right capabilities to get you to this level of crisis ready that I'm talking about. And then the second is an invitation to join the Crisis Ready community. So the community is a space of support and conversation. We have monthly book clubs, we have monthly mastermind sessions, we have roundtable discussions. And most recently, we've undertaken an initiative to design as a collective, as a community, which you're absolutely very, very, very welcome to come and be a part of, to create a communication culture best practice guidelines standard for every organization to help organizations and professionals up-level their crisis readiness. This is a massive initiative that the Crisis Ready Institute is hosting, is sponsoring for all of our community members to be a part of. So if you go to crisisreadyinstitute.com/CCM for Crisis Comms Mastery, you'll find more information about this. And then, of course, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, Agnes at crisisreadyinstitute.com, or just crisisreadyinstitute.com for more on what we do and how you can start to truly ingrain this skill set, these capabilities, this mindset to strengthen your crisis readiness and strengthen the viability of your organization and of you as a professional as we move into this era of challenge and change.
Want to enjoy lifetime access to all Crisis Comms Mastery sessions? Upgrade to an all-access pass today and get a limited time discount. Click the link in the sidebar to get started.